There's been a lot of publicity lately, for one reason or another, about the attitudes of the younger generation, almost as if they are a race apart, and it appears that some of them would like to be.
When we think about countercultures, none are more iconic than the hippie. With their long hair, their tie-dye, peace and free love. These bros, you know, you can probably smell them through your computer screen right now. Oh, Jesus, lads. The hippies threw away all of the traditions and the ideals of mainstream American society. Ugh, society. And they wanted to start again. You know, they wanted to make utopia, a paradise on earth, a new way of living, before they slowly were destroyed by the very thing they hated.
I like to teach the world to sing. Sing with me. Perfect harmony. Perfect harmony. I like to ride the world home and keep it company.
Today, we will tell the story of the hippies.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
1960s America was a very interesting time to be alive. JFK was the president in this time, and he's very iconic to this day. And it's because he stood for radical, crazy ideas, like not hating black people and not wanting the world to nuke itself. He signed the nuclear test ban in 1963. He literally invented this thing called the Peace Corps, which was where Americans could volunteer to go around the world in like these conflict zones and just fucking vibe with the bros. You know, just hang out. We haven't got to shoot each other. We can just have tea. Basically what I'm trying to say is JFK was this young, fresh face in politics. He was optimistic. He was a sign that the future might get better. And then he got fucking no-scoped in the back of a car.
And I gave it a great deal of thought.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Some people point to this moment in 1963 as like the beginning of the hippie movement, but there's a bunch of other moments in the 60s that are also very important. The increase in racial violence, which we could see through the Freedom Bus that got firebombed in 1961. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, where the whole entire Earth nearly had a server reset. The peaceful civil rights demo that happened in 1963, where the police got out a watering hose, just plowed the boys down and sent some dogs on them. 1964 Freedom Summer, where 3 civil rights workers got murdered. But then, of course, you have the Vietnam War, where America went to Vietnam to beat communism out of them. So you get the picture. The 60s, it was rough. Everything was kicking off. But the death of JFK can kind of be seen as like the straw that broke the camel's back. For the hippies, he was their boy. Finally, they had a progressive voice in the White House, and then he got fucking quick-scoped.
CBS News, without any flowers in its hair, is in San Francisco because this city has gained the reputation of being the hippie capital of the world.
The hippies weren't completely unique. They followed a long tradition of movements that took a look at society and just went, nah, not for me, mate. Some people put the origins of the hippie movement back into the late 1890s in Germany. Hippies in Germany. I could hardly believe this one myself, to be honest, but people make the claim. In the late 1890s to the early 1900s in Germany, there was a movement, a youth movement, known as Der Wandervogel, which meant wandering bird. These were them nature boys, them boys in the bushes going back to basics. You know, they were playing their folk songs, eating berries and going camping with the bros. It was cute. It was cute as fuck.
What's better than this? Guys being dudes.
And although they looked kind of, you know, like down and out, what's interesting is a lot of them were actually middle-class youth. They just didn't like mainstream society. They felt that mainstream society was rigid. It had these tight ideals and it wanted you to act, behave, and live your life in a certain way. It kind of stemmed from this philosophy coming from bros like Goethe, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Hermann Hesse. And these boys talked about a weird concept called individuality. What am I? Like, I'm a fucking, you know, I'm this, but, you know, I feel like I'm more than just my meat suit. So this idea of like self-reflection and this sort of return to monkey nature approach is believed to have sort of passively spread to America when Germans started to come to America in the early 1900s. And the Wandervogel values would spread through things like health shops, you know, like kind of alternative lifestyle eating legumes and, you know, kind of doing that stuff. I couldn't work out exactly how direct this influence was, but there was one group that you could call the big brother of the hippies, and that was the Beat Generation. Just quickly, when I jump on Google and type in my name, sometimes it can feel a little bit uncomfortable seeing your name on random websites. What's happening here is basically data brokers are selling your data to scammers and spammers. Your full name, your email address, your home address, your parents' address. And that's why I'm using Aura, which is the sponsor of today's video. Aura can show me which data brokers are selling my data and automatically submits opt-out requests for me. Not only does cleaning this up help reduce the amount of spam emails I get, but also it protects me from hackers who might want to try use this data to try and get into my social media accounts, my bank accounts. I don't know if you know this, but AT&T, they revealed that over 73 million customer records, both existing and former customers, appeared on the dark web. They're requesting to use stronger passwords, monitor account activity, consider credit freezes, or fraud alerts from credit bureaus. Well, Aura does all of that for me. And best of all, I don't have to download loads of separate different apps just because some company couldn't keep my data secure. And so if my data was compromised during this AT&T thing, I wouldn't worry because Aura has me sorted. It has me covered. You can go over to www.aura.com/Jimmy the Giant to start your 2-week free trial. The link is also in the description. Anyway, back to the video.
Anyway, I wrote the book because we're all gonna die. In the loneliness of my life, my father dead, my brother dead, my mother far away, my sister and my wife far away. Nothing here but my own tragic hands that once were guarded by a world, a sweet attention, that now are left to guide and disappear their own way into the common dark of all our death.
The Beat Generation was basically a bunch of writers, like authors who, you know, they had these big questions. They wanted to challenge society, you know, and they had a different way of dressing. They wore these sweet berets, all black, sunglasses, they had goatees. They were fans of this kind of alternative philosophy. You know, if you dropped a banging Nietzsche quote mid-conversation, they might start throwing words at you like, cool man, I dig that, groovy. This was called hip slang. Do you see what I see? Hip? Interesting.
Oh, what you call a beatnik? You dig?
The word hip meant to be kind of aware of this underground culture of like listening to jazz music, going to coffee shops, talking about poetry, alternative politics. A culture that was very far away from traditional American culture. And it was kind of rough. The word beat means to be like beat down. And a lot of the books tended to tell of stories of like the underbelly of American society, talking about junkies and homeless, all these kind of like nomadic traveler types. And it was kind of a critique of this new post-war American culture.
6 years after the end of World War II, America is wealthier than ever. 2/3 of Americans now live in urban areas, attracted by booming job markets.
Post-World War II, America was a weird place. Literally just before it was the Great Depression, where average Americans were queuing up to get crumbs of bread. And then over in Europe, Hitler starts kicking off, and this was payday for America. America kind of became the financier of the war, and the country went through a wartime economy, which was basically a very state-backed economy that funneled the taxpayer money into creating industries that would help the war effort. This overnight ended the Great Depression. It took unemployment from 25% down to 1.2%. It led to insane technological advancements, Ford, General Motors, Boeing, IBM, advancements in medicine, advancements in science. This wartime economy, in part, created the greatest economic boom the world has ever seen, and somehow created a generation of Americans who really oppose government spending. And so as these American war heroes hobbled home with their missing eyeballs and ears, they returned to a radically different America and a new home, suburbia.
Across the United States, new homes are springing up by the thousands for our rapidly growing population. The growth of these regions presents one of the biggest challenges facing our nation.
American suburbia is like this urban sprawl where they just make endless rows of houses that were so big it would take like a pilgrimage to walk to the shops. But lucky for these Americans, they could buy the brand new Ford Anglia. You could drive on these brand new highways to the shopping mall or to your job where you'd work endless hours crunching the numbers before the end of the quarter. On your way home, you could buy a McTriple cooked for you in 2 minutes. You could have 2,000 calories in your pipes. And then to relax from a long day, you could sit on your nice new sofa, crack open a cold Budweiser, flick on your shiny new television set to see an advert for the Fat Buster 5000 to work off some of those McTriples you've been getting a bit thicker, Barry. And then go to sleep on your lovely new double bed to wake up and do it all again and again and again, until your mind and soul were slowly crushed by this consumerist nation of... Okay, so that's how the beatniks saw reality. Whether it was exactly like that or not, you can question it. They were incredibly nihilistic, disillusioned with like consumer society, and they loved nothing more than to sit drinking coffee and complaining about it.
Like, I mean, what are they doing with their lives? Not making chromium grills, not shuffling secret papers, selling deodorants, not doing anything important. Just mill around causing trouble, asking questions, thinking. Truly shocking, man.
But as time passed, these words, they weren't enough. Someone needed to do something about it. Someone needed to live out different values. And in steps the hippies. 1965 was kind of like a consolidating moment for the hippies. It had risen into like mainstream awareness. The word hippie was now commonly tied to these people. And a lot of people see it with connection to the escalation in the Vietnam War. They were like napalming civilians, just burning children. And society was looking at this like, are we paying for this? And also, in this time, America were ramping up recruitment for young men to go and die in this very unpopular war, which through the eyes of the hippies was seen as a war to defend capitalism, which was now an ideology that they had grown very skeptical towards. And so it created this deep ideological split from the hippies to mainstream society. The hippies, off of the back of the beatniks, were basically looking at American society, its traditional Christian conservative values, seeing how that had led to the society they were living in now, which they didn't like that much, and they decided to completely reject traditional values. It's very important to note that your average hippie, despite looking like he's homeless, more often than not, they were actually white, middle class and upper class children. A lot of them were college educated. They'd grown up and lived these sort of consumerist lifestyles, but they saw and felt like a shallowness. They didn't feel that this made them happy. They didn't see that their parents were happy. And so the hippies, after seeing all of that, said, no, not for me, buddy boy. Me no wanted that.
We tell young people today, drop out of school, because schools, education today, is the worst narcotic drug of all. Don't politic, don't vote. These are old men's games. You can't get caught in the conforming, rote lockstep, which we call American society.
This rejection bled into every aspect of hippie culture. You look at the way they dressed, like men had long hair, long beards, and the idea was going back to nature. Just let nature do its thing, be wild. Don't constrain yourself. Women would have long flowing hair, flowers in their hair. The clothing was like cheap, handmade clothing. You'd do it yourself, or you go to a flea market and buy it off a lady called Sunshine, who tells you that every single stitch has a bit of love in it.
How to be a hippie.
You'd wear sandals, beads, loose-fitting, flowing clothes. And you'd even see it like they would wear peasants' clothes. Like it couldn't get more on the nose. The idea to reject consumerism and reject status. And if you just wanted to go full fucking hippie, you didn't have to wear clothes at all. No clothes. What could be more natural than just getting your todge out and running through a field of wheat? Like you're fucking Theresa May.
What's the naughtiest thing you ever did? I have to confess, when me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat, the farmers weren't too pleased about that.
But I am missing one very key, one very vital detail to the hippie aesthetic, and that is psychedelia.
This girl is on an LSD trip. The music, a song of praise to LSD. A song of praise to acid.
I'm doing my drug warning. Drugs. No, my friends. No, don't do it. Don't do it. I can't make a video about the hippies without talking about LSD. This sort of drug that would put you on like a 9-hour trip and it would have you saying things like, bro, what even like, dude, is that like if you think about it, you know? It's exactly, man, fuck. I joke around, but LSD was like a pathway to introspection and self-reflection for many people, all whilst making the world look like it was melting in front of you.
Well, LSD has changed me religiously. I was a smart aleck, Harvard professor, bourbon-drinking atheist, intellectual, before I took LSD. Now I'm God intoxicated.
But interesting, when it comes to the psychedelic aesthetic, although it might look like it came directly from LSD, there's actually more of a background to it. It actually comes from a movement in the late 1800s called Art Nouveau. This was a French wave of art that came out of the newly industrialized world. They wanted to capture the vibrancy of this transformation in society. Or you could see it as like an excuse to just draw naked women. There was a definite focus on like the feminine, the chaotic feminine, long flowing hair, patterns, nature, peacocks. Anyway, it's said that a bunch of hippies went to an art exhibition somewhere outside of San Francisco in 1965, and they took inspiration from this art style and applied it to music posters. They wanted their posters to stand out, and this was a way of grabbing people's attention. So we can explain this psychedelic aesthetic as basically Art Nouveau on acid. And this would spread into all of hippie culture, into hippie art, into hippie fashion, hippie music, creating some things that are still widely loved to this day, like Jimi Hendrix, Beatles. Elements in the fashion to this day, like the loose-fitting clothes, the iconic VW Beetles, the VW camper vans, all these things we look back on very fondly. They're iconic, vivid imageries of this era, and as a result of this art style. And there would be one specific place, one breeding ground that was creating this hippie movement, and that was communes.
The time of the lone wolf is past. It's time to work together. If we don't learn to work with the hardest people in the world to work next to, then we'll never make it.
Most subcultures, although countercultural, still exist somewhere in mainstream, maybe on the very fringes. But the original hippies rejected everything. You know, they rejected having a family, having normal relationships. They were all like in open relationships. And this led to a rejection of how they would organize their own societies and how they would live. The Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco is one of the most iconic places with regard to the hippie movement. And it'd be here where a number of these hippie communes would open. There was this image that communes that the hippies lived in were pretty awful and stinky. But some hippie communes are actually a bit more organized, and they would be out in nature as opposed to in urban areas, where they might have a farm where they would grow carrots and potatoes and shit. They would even raise children communally. You know, I'm not a dad, man. I didn't control you, bro. You'd have places like Drop City, Morningstar Ranch, Twin Oaks community. And these were like these big self-sustainable communities. It's been said that between the 60s and 70s, there was as many as 3,000 communes. And I have a quote here that in 1970, an article in Playboy magazine, you naughty dogs, John Polak estimated that there were 35,800 hippies in Vermont, who accounted to roughly 33% of the total 107,527 people in the state between the ages of 18 and 34. I don't know how much of an estimate that is. It's a very specific number. And like, just picture this in the eyes of the youth culture at the time when this is happening. Nothing like it's ever happened before. It was exciting. And if you were raised in middle America, suburbia, the sort of rebellious young energy that was there would make people up and leave their families. And it was like a pilgrimage to go to San Francisco and live in these communes.
And I didn't have any clear kind of picture of what it was I was going to, except that I felt it would be a life in which there could be more for me.
And it probably sounds quite obvious that this communal focus and living had a very deep philosophical root. The hippies were them spiritual bunnies. They wouldn't be talking about who won the Arsenal game last night. They'd be talking about what's the fucking meaning of all this? What's life about? And because, you know, they love rejecting every single thing, there was this feeling that like Christianity just wasn't hitting anymore, you know? So they started to switch to some more potent stuff. Buddhism, Hare Krishna, Hinduism. These spiritual practices were more focused on like introspection, you know, like destroying your ego, transcend the physical realm and aspire to greater depths of, you know, other things that a fucking guy called Wolf would tell you at 3 a.m. at an after party. And it might not be surprising, but most of this was being achieved through taking lots and lots of acid. To me, there's something so ironically American about LSD. Like Tibetan monks, they would dedicate their entire lives. They were disciplined people who would spend forever trying to achieve one day enlightenment. But America found a way of putting it on a piece of paper that you can buy and just shortcut the whole process and do it like that. We can see this spirituality, this philosophy filtering into politics. Lots of hippies were communists or socialists, and many of these communes operated in like a communistic way. Part of the fashion was kind of wearing like communist symbology. They would have flags of the faces of communist dictators. And like, politics really does just go very hand in hand with the hippie movement. The hippie movement really came about as anti-war protests and civil rights activism. But from my understanding, not every single hippie was like an avowed communist. For lots of the hippies, there was actually a rejection of politics in and of itself. The idea of like dropping out of school also meant like dropping out of the system, you know, stop voting. A lot of hippies were actually just trying to make their own alternative society. And look, as this movement was growing and growing, affecting the world and changing people's minds, the American government started to get a little bit antsy. All this fighting the man stuff, the dropping out the system thing, Uncle Sam wasn't gonna take it. The Summer of Love, 1967. This massive pilgrimage of young people towards San Francisco to go live in communes and do free love and all that shit. It led to San Francisco having some problems. It became a bit stinky, a bit messy, overcrowded, unsanitary, drug usage, teenage pregnancies, STDs, but you know, it weren't all fun and games. And the locals didn't love it. In 1969, you had Woodstock Festival, which is, we look back on it as this iconic thing, but at the time, people criticized it for its poor organization that led to food shortages, drainage, sewage issues, and again, drug use. In 1969, the Altamont Free concert, this ended in violence and 4 deaths. And so mainstream society was seeing this, and it was drumming up a moral panic. More and more news articles and reports about the hippies and kind of just saying how scary it is. And so this led to a big backlash and a series of laws being passed.
America's public enemy #1 is drug abuse.
Your boy Nixon dropped the infamous Controlled Substances Act of 1970. This led to loads of arrests for people using LSD and weed, and was being used as like a way for police to kind of mistreat hippies, and reports that they would just break into communes and arrest people, beat them up. Protesters, activists were being arrested. Very famously in 1968, there were mass arrests at the Democratic National Conference. 1966, the Sunset Strip curfew riots. After waves of political, legislative moves and propaganda against the hippies, they were seeing the hippies as like a threat to American society. That America might descend into communism and everyone becomes a lazy dropout drug user. These men with womanly long hair, and they're trying to recruit your little Billy. We can't be having that.
See, hippies were created by the press. I mean, it was created from outside. It was a thing masked by the media.
This medium destroyed the use of the word. I can't tell my girl I love her anymore because, like, she's seen that in 500 John Wayne movies, man. You can't use the word. It's so commercial now, man. Like, it's going down too much now. Like, that's what they're arguing about. Like, what does it mean? It doesn't have a meaning anymore.
The hippies never died in, like, a conventional sense. In fact, really, it was the opposite. In 1971, Coca-Cola ran an advert, and it was called, "I'd like to buy the world a Coke."
I'd like to buy the world a Coke and keep it company.
In effect, the hippies just got swallowed up by the mainstream culture. The consumerist culture that they rejected just consumed them. The music genre that went from Bazza just playing his out-of-tune guitar, standing on a wooden crate in front of people for free, were now big artists. They were rich, you know, they had record labels signing them. The festivals they would play at that were once free were now these big corporate sponsored events. Even the fashion, you could now walk into like mainstream fashion outlets and buy hippie clothes. The spread of like organic food, health stores, holistic healing. Now white middle class Brian and Barbara were doing yoga and talking about these new soy products. So despite all the intentions to try and destroy mainstream consumerist America, it just became mainstream consumerist America.
Said that we are here not only to stop the war, but to call for freedom.
But then on the brighter side, also the hippies kind of declined because they sort of achieved their purpose. A lot of people point to 1975 as being the end of the hippie era, and that's because the Vietnam War finished. The main point of the hippies was protesting the Vietnam War, and they did it. The pressure helped end that war, and they achieved tons of shit politically. Like in 1964, racial segregation in America was made illegal through the Civil Rights Act. Also the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. These did massive things for giving rights to black people in America. They also had big effect on like the environment. I haven't really mentioned the environment, but they were big environmentalists. The National Environmental Policy Act was passed in 1970. You had Roe v. Wade in 1973. Obviously, you know, things have changed a bit. Title IX in 1972. They started the free speech movement in 1964 because America was trying to suppress their rights to speak and protest. And people also say it was like the beginning of gay rights. So you might be wondering why, if it was so socially and politically successful, why were Mr. and Mrs. Jones not packing their bags and leaving the suburbs and heading to a squat? Well, it's because the hippie movement was very naive and it was full of like logical contradictions.
I have been seeing the cycle come around again after 20 years. A lot of things that were happening in the 60s are happening again. The young people in the 70s got involved again in what we were trying to avoid, and that was materialism, the rat race, nervousness and stress reality.
The hippie ideology is kind of inherently flawed because they talk endlessly about individuality, finding yourself, finding your own voice, your own expression, your own way of dressing, your own way of being. But somehow, the hippies all dressed the same, they all looked the same, they all ate the same foods, listened to the same music, had the same politics, lived the same way. And so there was this irony. On top of this, the hippies were often depicted as a kind of holier than thou. They always seemed to put themselves as being more enlightened and better than everyone else. They would have these sort of terms they would use to refer to like your average person. They would call them straights and squares, and they would refer to society as the man or the establishment. And this was a very unnuanced view of society. It just put them in a box of like us versus them. The hippies couldn't perceive of the fact that there might be a person who actually likes his office job. They like their traditional marriage and raising their kids, and the dad was masculine and the mum was feminine. So for them, it was easier to see it as them against us. We're the enlightened, better ones, and they just need to try and catch up.
Our whole consciousness, everything, this is observant phenomena that the Buddhists pointed out. No longer is it poetry, the light of consciousness. There's got to be a deep meaning in there. That's all I'm suggesting to you.
When it comes to the communes, some of the communes still exist to this day. They're still there. But by and large, majority of them didn't work out. And that's kind of because of these very lax attitudes towards rules and towards responsibility and stuff like that. And it comes down to, ultimately, who's going to clean the dishes? The fun jobs are all well and good. You know, if I'm cutting down the trees with Mickey and Rog, and we're going to build some banging prayer tent, you know, that's sick. That's fun. But who's going to clean the skiddies off the toilet? You know, there's a lot of vegetarians in these communes, so someone's got to do it. Perhaps when there was just 10 of you and you're all really close friends and you have a responsibility to each other, maybe you took it in turns. But now when there's like 100+ of you, a few of those people are probably going to be lazier. Some of the dudes just wanted to come enjoy some free love, smoke weed, do LSD all day and not really do much. And that might piss you off. If I'm busy hard working making this utopia, Barry, I need you to take the fucking bin bags out. At this scale, the social contract kind of breaks down. Disagreement and resentment grows, and yeah, the society just can't work.
I think I'm the same person now that I was 20 years ago on the inside. On the outside, I've changed, I've aged, and I've grown up in my thinking, but basically the same person inside me is the same person that was there 20 years ago.
Now we have to recognize that these hippies with their wild, crazy attitudes to changing the world, they were 20. You know, they were young, they were naive. Free love probably resulted in a lot of relationship trauma, the spread of STDs, unwanted pregnancies, drug use. While some people might have found enlightenment, the other people found heroin and crack. Haight-Ashbury, the once utopia of hippies, is now just riddled with crime and drug problems. But what happened to the hippies really was that they kind of just grew up, but they kept the hippie spirit with them. A spirit that we can see everywhere. The impact of the hippie movement is so incredibly big. There's no coincidence that San Francisco became like the technological hub of the world. Steve Jobs famously was a hippie, or at least very inspired by the hippie generation.
One of the questions I asked everyone in the series was, are you a hippie or a nerd?
Oh, if I had to pick one of those two, I'm clearly a hippie. All the people I work with were clearly in that category too.
And lots of hippies, as they grew up, wanted to try and find technological ways of bettering society. Did it work? I mean, we can argue, but they at least tried. The civil rights movement that happened in the 60s and 70s has changed America. Racism isn't socially acceptable like it was back then, like in the 50s, etc. If we look at fashion and the way people express themselves now and the crazy outfits people can wear, I mean, even just haircuts. Like if a guy has long hair, we don't assume he's a woman, we just assume he's probably a vegan. Music festivals, holistic health, yoga, whole foods, organic food, vegan, vegetarian, you know, there's so many things that exist now that we can point directly to the hippie movement. Look, it's very easy for us to criticize the hippies and point out where they were silly and where it didn't work out, but we have to acknowledge that the hippies had a point. They grew up in a world of mindless consumption. They looked around and saw the commercialization of literally everything, the breakdown in the community and the care for the collective, a disrespect towards nature and the impact humans are having on nature. They saw a strict, rigid social conformity. They saw a hatred of the other, and they wanted to do something about all of that, and they did. It may have been flawed. It may not have made utopia, but I think that many of the critiques that the hippies made of mainstream culture are just as relevant now as they were back then.
I think that's what the hippies were trying to do 20 years ago, trying to change society a little bit. Even though it perhaps didn't totally work the way we hoped it would, I think a lot of good things came from it.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to jump on the Discord. You can help me research and we talk about all these topics over there in much more depth. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. Peace.